Hello everyone, thank you for joining me. My name is Sarah, and in today's video we're going to be going over how to manage credentials within your RedTeam Flex database. So the first thing we're going to be talking about today is what is a credential and how do we set up credentials for use within our database. Then we'll progress to how we can track those credentials within the database. So the first place to take a look is within your configuration menu. You will find an item here titled Credentials. Now, credentials are, strictly speaking, documentation. This is RedTeam's terminology for any documentation that you may wish to keep on your vendors, on your employees, or on your equipment. Now, credentials are, in general, most often used with vendors, but again, there's a variety of types of documentation that you might keep for various profiles within your database. So if we want to edit or create new types of credentials for our database for use, or new types of documentation, we would come here to the configuration menu and click on Credentials. This is going to show you your list of existing credentials. Now, we start you out with a default list of credentials, but you can add as many different pieces of documentation as you may need to track. And you'll see there are various types here. You can give each document a description or name, and then you can indicate if they're required or not. So to create a new type of credential or a new type of document, you would click the new icon up here in the right-hand corner. And the type of credential is going to help explain how you would use that documentation. So an employee credential might be a piece of documentation that we need on file for our employees, such as OSHA certifications or emergency contact information, anything that we may track for our employees within their profiles. An entity type credential is a piece of documentation for use with our vendors, and what the term entity is specifying is that we only need one copy of that document on file per entity. Meaning that something I collect for this vendor may be useful across multiple projects. For example, a W-9. If I collect one W-9 from that vendor, I don't then need a new one for each project. That one W-9 will serve for that vendor across all projects. That would be an entity type credential. Of course, as it states, an equipment type of credential would be a piece of documentation that we plan to keep on file for any of our equipment in our equipment menu. So if I create a profile for a backhoe or a company truck or even a laptop, I can then upload pieces of documentation related to that piece of equipment within my database. So that's an equipment type. And then the last type we see here is the project type credential. And that is also for use with vendors, but it's stating that I will need a new one of these per project, not per entity. So as opposed to that example we gave of the W-9, this would be a different type of document where we need a new one every single time we create a new project or we interact with a vendor on a new project. And when we specify entity or project, that's going to help us more accurately track what we need from a given vendor on a given project. So we'd pick the correct type here. We'd give a description, essentially a title for that piece of documentation, and a narrative, which is a description or details about that piece of documentation. Down here we've got a couple of checkboxes. Is that piece of documentation required for us to work with that vendor or for us to allow that employee to work, or is it simply something that's nice to have? And then an expiration date. Is that required? That will allow you to indicate if this type of document actually has an expiration date or if it's something that is good indefinitely while it's on file. So once we've filled in the information, we will then see that credential in the list here. And you can see the type, of course. And then you can choose to edit that credential at any time. By clicking the tools icon, we can go ahead and edit any of the information that we just looked over. And if we've never used the credential before, we can go ahead and delete it. Now, if we've stored any of this type of credential on file within the database, we will no longer be able to delete it. But we can still come to the edit screen and inactivate it. We now see an additional checkbox here. That allows me to say we have been collecting automobile liability forms over the course of time, but we're not planning on collecting any more. We will no longer be collecting this piece of documentation, and we don't want it to be an option throughout our database, so we can go ahead and turn it off. And then, of course, you'd click Save. So this is how we create and manage the list of documentation that we may collect throughout the database. Now let's go and take a look at how we can upload credentials. So for one, we'll take a look at the Employees menu, and we'll show you where you can go ahead and upload credentials for an employee. So if we go ahead and click into an employee profile, to upload a credential, you would need the permission to edit. So we can go ahead and edit. And we're going to scroll down relatively near the bottom. There is a section for credentials right here. So you'd come down to the credentials section and hit Add Credential. And it's as simple as selecting the type of credential. Now in the employee profile, you're only going to see the employee type credential options that you created in the configuration menu. You'd go ahead and pick the type of form that you're uploading, and then you'd fill in the applicable information, reference number, expiration date, or amount as necessary, and attach the file here to save. You'd then scroll back up and save the employee profile. As for equipment, that's going to work in much the same way. We'd go ahead and open an equipment profile from our equipment menu. And we would want to edit. Notice there's a section down here for credentials, but we'll need to click the edit button in order to add credentials. So here we can see our credentials section, and now we can add new credentials, or if there's more in the list than what we can see here, notice you've got a show all button to go ahead and show all credentials on file. Once you add a new credential, you can see here that you have the ability to click this little attachment folder to view the file or leave notes. And then you can come back here to the tools icon where you can then edit or renew this piece of documentation. Of course, as we make changes, we'll want to save that equipment profile. And then perhaps the most important space where we can utilize credentials is going to be the vendors menu. Those entity and project type credentials are going to be usable here in the vendors menu, and that's where we most often see clients using credentials, is to track documentation that you may need for a vendor before you're able to allow them to work on a work site. So if we click that vendor profile, we'll be able to see and access the credentials section without even hitting the edit button. We have the Credentials tab right down here on the main profile page for this vendor. We don't need to click the edit button. We do have the ability to go ahead and add new credentials here, and that looks exactly the same as what we saw within the employee or equipment menus. We simply select from the drop-down which type of credential we want to add. This is the list that you built in the configuration menu, and you're going to see both entity and project type credential options here. You'll enter, as needed, the remaining information, which would be the reference number, the expiration date, which may or may not be required, depending on the type of document, and the amount. We can then go ahead and upload the attachment right here and indicate if this item is mandatory. And then we can go ahead and save. Now, if a credential has an expiration date, we will see that expiration date over here on the right. You can see all of these are actually in red because they're expired. And if we need to renew a particular document, we can go ahead and click the tools icon to renew it. We also have this little download folder to allow us to view the attachment there, that actual file. Now, we are going to have another video that covers credential reporting. So there is reporting capability both company-wide for your vendor credentials and within your commitment forms. You'll be able to track what credentials are required as you create subcontracts and purchase orders with your vendors. But of course, that's going to be in a different video. So for today, that's all we have for you on how to create your list of credentials and manage those within your employees, equipment, and vendor profiles. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for choosing Red Team Flex.